The wind in Wyoming territory was not weather. It was a presence. It had a voice that mourned in the eaves of the barn and a solidness that could lean a man back on his heels. It scoured the high plains until the grass was the color of a wolf's pelt, and the soil was ground to a fine, restless powder. In the distance, the Bighorn Mountains held the sky on their shoulders, their peaks bruised with the slate gray of a storm that would not break. This was the world Cole Mercer had chosen, a world pared down to fence posts, livestock, and silence. His ranch was a modest claim, pressed against the unforgiving edge of a territory still shrugging off its wildness. The nearest town, Wayfarer's Rest, was a day's ride and consisted of little more than a collection of sod and timber buildings huddled together against the ceaseless wind, a general store, a blacksmith's forge whose hammerfall was the town's heartbeat, and a new church, its raw pine boards still weeping sap. It was a place of quiet judgments and hard truths, where a man's worth was measured by the calluses on his hands and the straightness of his fence lines. Cole preferred his own company. His fences were straight. He was 32 years old. With the quiet economy of movement that comes from living alone, every action had a purpose. From the way he swung an axe to the way he poured his morning coffee, he had built his solitude like a fortress, stone by stone. After the noise and dust of his brother Daniel's death had settled, the memory was a physical thing. A shard of rock lodged beneath his ribs, a land dispute, a heated word, a gunshot that had echoed and then been swallowed by the same uncaring wind. Cole had been there. He had not been fast enough, not smart enough. He had failed to protect his own. So he had sworn off the business of other people, retreating to this plot of land where the only life he was responsible for was his own, and that of the cattle who asked for nothing but grass and water. That afternoon, the sky turned the color of a dirty bruise. The wind, usually a steady pressure, began to come in violent, unpredictable gusts, kicking up dust devils that danced and died on the prairie. A storm was coming. Not of rain, but of earth. He rode north along his fence line, his neckerchief pulled up over his nose and mouth, his eyes narrowed to slits against the stinging grit. The wire hummed a low, mournful tune, a sound that usually brought him a grim sort of peace. It was the sound of his boundary, the line between his world and everyone else's. He was checking the tension on a strand of barbed wire, the metal cold against his leather gloves. When he heard it, it was not the wind, nor the creak of his saddle, nor the low complaint of his horse. It was a sound that did not belong, a thin, ragged cough, snatched and nearly torn apart by the gale. He froze, listening. The wind howled, throwing a sheet of dust so thick it momentarily erased the landscape. He waited. There it was again, closer this time, a desperate, tearing sound from the direction of the dry creek bed that cut across the corner of his property. Trouble. His first instinct, honed by years of practice, was to mount his horse and ride in the opposite direction. Trouble was not his concern, not anymore. But the sound was human. It was the sound of lungs fighting for air, a sound he remembered from his brother's last moments. The shard of rock under his ribs twisted. He cursed, a low, bitter sound that the wind stole from his lips, and turned his horse toward the creek. He found her crumpled at the bottom of the arroyo, a heap of dark cloth and darker hair, half buried by the shifting dust. She looked like a bird that had fallen from the sky, her limbs tangled and still. For a moment, he thought she was dead. Then she coughed again, a spasm that shook her entire frame. Cole dismounted, his boots sinking into the soft earth. He approached her slowly, as he would a spooked horse. She was young, maybe 19 or 20, her face smudged with dirt and streaked with tears that had long since dried. A raw scratch ran from her temple to her jaw, and her feet, impossibly, were bare. The soles cracked and bleeding. She was clutching something to her chest, a small object wrapped in her fist. When his shadow fell over her, her eyes flew open. They were the color of a stormy sky, filled with a terror so profound it made his breath catch. She scrambled backward, Crab walking away from him until her back hit the hard slope of the creek bed. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the object. He saw the firelight glint off it now, a small knife, its blade no longer than his finger. "Stay back," she rasped, her voice as dry as the dust swirling around them. Cole raised his hands slowly, palms open. "Easy, I'm not going to hurt you." She watched him, her chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid breaths. He could see the exhaustion warring with the fear in her eyes. She was a cornered animal, ready to fight even though she had nothing left. "The storm's getting worse," he said, his voice even and low. "You can't stay out here." "No," she whispered. "No town. Don't take me to the pastor." The words hung in the air, strange and specific. Pastor, town. The plea was not for her life, but against a particular fate. He knew of the new church in Wayfarer's Rest, and of the more established, more fervent congregation over in Crossing Hollow, a town known for its rigid piety. He looked at her torn dress, the scratches, the bare feet. She was a runaway, and someone was looking for her. Every instinct screamed at him to leave her, to ride away and forget he had ever seen her. This was the kind of trouble that did not just pass through. It put down roots and strangled everything around it. He looked at her, and he saw Daniel's face, pale and surprised, looking up at him from the dirt. "All right," he heard himself say, the word tasting like a betrayal of his own hard-won peace. "No town." He offered her his hand. She stared at it, her gaze flickering from his hand to his face, searching for the lie. She did not take it. With a groan, she used the creek wall to push herself to her feet, swaying unsteadily. She kept the knife in her hand. He did not blame her. The line cabin was a small, solid box of notched logs chinked with mud and moss, built for sheltering cowboys who worked the far edges of the ranch. It was spare, containing only a narrow cot, a small potbelly stove, and a few hooks on the wall. It smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and pine. Cole led her inside, the wind slamming the door shut behind them with a crack like a pistol shot. The girl flinched, pressing herself against the wall, the knife held forward. Ada. He would learn her name was later. For now, she was just a storm-blown stranger. Cole ignored her, moving with the deliberate calm he reserved for breaking a wild colt. He lit the lantern, its yellow glow pushing back the gloom and revealing the dust motes dancing in the air. He laid a fire in the stove, the kindling catching with a satisfying whoosh. Then he took a tin cup, filled it with water from the barrel in the corner, and set it on the stove to warm. He did all of this without looking directly at her, giving her space, letting the simple, domestic sounds of the cabin soothe the wild fear in her eyes. He took a clean wool blanket from a storage box and placed it on the cot. "You can rest there," he said, his voice carefully neutral. He gestured to the warming cup. "There's water." He unbuckled his gun belt and, after a moment's hesitation, hung it on a hook on the far wall, next to the door. It was well within her line of sight. It was a statement, though he was not entirely sure what he meant by it. It was a promise of the world's violence, and a promise that, for now, it would be held in check. He was not a savior. He was a man with a fence line, and she had just crossed it. She watched him, her suspicion a tangible thing in the small room. She did not move toward the cot. She did not put down the knife. As the cabin slowly warmed, she slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor, her knees drawn up to her chest, the blanket on the cot untouched. Cole sat on the only other surface, a low stool near the stove, and occupied himself with cleaning his rifle. The familiar, methodical task, a comfort. The storm raged outside, a physical manifestation of the turmoil that had just entered his life. He wanted nothing more than to be alone, to feel the solid, uncomplicated solitude he had cultivated. But he could not bring himself to force her out. The memory of his failure was too strong. He had drawn a line around his world with barbed wire, and now he had willingly carried trouble across it. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the howl of the wind and the crackle of the fire. The girl, Ada, eventually succumbed to an exhausted, fitful sleep, her head slumping against her knees. Even in sleep, her hand did not release its grip on the small knife. Cole watched her, the lantern light carving sharp shadows on her face. He saw the faint bruising on her cheek that he had not noticed before. He saw the way she shuddered, a low whimper escaping her lips. She was dreaming, and the dreams were not kind. He stayed on his stool, his rifle across his laps, and kept watch. He was a man who believed in boundaries, in the clear distinction between what was his and what was not. The girl was not his, her trouble was not his, yet here she was, inside his cabin, inside his world. The first crack had appeared in the walls of his fortress. Late into the night, when the storm had begun to wear itself out, a new sound cut through the wind's diminishing moan. It was sharp, deliberate. Someone was knocking on the door. 3 solid raps, loud and clear and full of purpose. Cole's hand tightened on his rifle. Across the room, the girl's eyes snapped open, wide with a fresh wave of terror. The outside world, the world he had tried so hard to keep at bay, had come looking for them. Cole moved from the stool to the door in a single fluid motion, the rifle held low and ready. Ada scrambled back into the corner, making herself small, her breath a hitching sound in the sudden quiet of the cabin. The wind had died down, and the knocking, when it came again, was louder, more insistent. "Who is it?" Cole's voice was flat, carrying easily through the wood. A pause, then a man's voice, weary and raw from the wind. "Just a rider. Got caught in that blow. Saw your light. I mean no harm." Cole's eyes flicked to Ada. Her face was a mask of pure panic. He gave a short, almost imperceptible shake of his head. He placed the rifle against the wall by the door frame and eased the latch. He opened the door only a few inches, his body blocking the view into the cabin. The man outside was caked in dust, his horse a ghostly shape behind him in the gloom. He was just a stray cowboy, his face creased with exhaustion. "Sorry to bother you, Mr. My horse threw a shoe. I was just hoping to wait out the worst of it." "The worst is over," Cole said. "The rain's coming now." As if on cue, a fat drop of water hit the dusty ground. Then another. "You can water your horse at the trough behind the main house. About a mile south. There's a lean-to on the barn you can use." The man nodded, his gratitude plain. "Much obliged." He glanced past Cole, trying to see into the warmth of the cabin. "You got family in there?" "No," Cole said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "I don't." He closed the door firmly, the latch clicking shut with a sound of finality. He turned back to the room. Ada was still pressed into the corner, her knuckles white where she gripped the little knife. He did not say anything, just picked up the rifle and returned to his stool. The moment of immediate danger had passed, but something had shifted between them. He had lied for her. He had claimed the cabin, and its solitude, as his alone, effectively making her invisible. He had drawn her inside his boundary. The dust storm gave way to a steady, soaking rain. For 3 days, it fell without pause, a gray sheet of water that turned the world to mud and mist. The steady drumming on the cabin's tin roof became the rhythm of their lives, a constant reminder of their confinement, the small space, which had felt like a refuge from the storm, now felt like a cage. They lived around each other in a careful, silent orbit. The unspoken rules of their cohabitation were established without a single word. He never looked at her for more than a moment, affording her a privacy that the thin walls could not. She, in turn, no longer kept her back pressed to the wall, a small but significant surrender of her constant state of defense. They learned the cadence of each other's breathing, the sound of a footstep on the wood floor, the quiet scrape of a cup being set down. On the first morning, Cole cooked beans and bacon, the smell filling the small space. He divided the food onto 2 tin plates and set one on the floor near her, along with a cup of hot, black coffee. She watched him for a long time before she finally ate, her movements slow and cautious. Later, he took a clean rag and a basin of warm water and silently knelt before her. He gestured to her feet. She flinched, pulling them back, her eyes wide with suspicion. "They'll get infected," he said simply. It was not a request, but a statement of fact. She hesitated, then slowly, reluctantly, extended one foot. He cleaned the cuts and scrapes with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his rough hands, then wrapped them in strips of clean cloth. He did the same for the other foot, his touch impersonal, his focus entirely on the task. When he was done, he stood and tossed the dirty water out into the rain. He had tended to her wounds, but he had not breached the wall of her fear. The silence in the cabin was thick, but it was not empty. It was filled with the things they did not say. On the second day, while Cole was outside checking on his horse in the small shed attached to the cabin, Ada found a small, leather-bound book tucked onto a high shelf. Its cover was worn smooth with handling. She opened it to find not prose, but poetry. The script, a delicate, feminine hand. It was a book of verses, simple and heartfelt, about seasons and sorrows and the quiet beauty of the plains. When Cole returned, he saw her with the book open in her lap. He stopped for a moment in the doorway, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, then continued on as if he had not noticed. He did not ask her to put it away. It had been his mother's. Letting her hold it was another unspoken concession, a small offering of his past. In return, she began to contribute to their shared existence. She kept the fire fed and swept the floor with a makeshift broom of twigs. She learned to anticipate when he might want coffee, and would have a cup warming on the stove. One afternoon, he brought in a piece of saddle leather that needed mending. He showed her how to use an awl and thread, how to pull the stitches tight and even. He taught her the right way to strike a spark from flint and steel, holding her hand briefly to correct the angle. A fleeting, practical touch that was over before it could become anything else. That night, the storm in her mind broke loose. He was dozing on his stool, the rifle propped beside him, when a choked cry tore through the cabin. He came awake instantly. Ada was bolt upright on the cot, her eyes wide and unseeing, her hands scrabbling at the blanket as if trying to fight her way out of it. She was caught in a nightmare, her breath coming in ragged, terrified sobs. He wanted to go to her, to say something, anything, to pull her back from the darkness that had claimed her. But he saw the sheer, animal terror on her face, and he understood that his presence would only be another threat. To acknowledge her fear would be to shame her. So he stayed perfectly still, regulating his own breathing to a slow, even rhythm, and pretended to be asleep. He listened as her frantic breath slowly subsided, as the shudders racking her body gradually eased. He listened until she was just a quiet, miserable huddle under the blanket. In the morning, neither of them mentioned it, but a tiny, fragile seed of trust had been planted. He had seen her at her most vulnerable and had granted her the dignity of looking away. By the fourth morning, the rain had lessened to a miserable drizzle, but their supplies had dwindled to the bottom of the flour sack and the last of the coffee. He had no choice. He had to ride to Wayfarer's Rest. "I need to get supplies," he announced to the room. "I'll be back before nightfall. Don't open the door for anyone." She just nodded, her eyes following him as he pulled on his slicker and settled his hat on his head. He strapped on his gun belt, the weight of it a familiar burden. Leaving her here felt like a risk. Trusting her to stay felt like an even bigger one. The ride to town was a slog through mud and standing water. Wayfarer's Rest looked bleak under the gray sky. The street a river of muck, the buildings hunched and damp. He tied his horse outside the general store and stepped inside. The little bell over the door announcing his arrival with a cheerful jingle that was entirely out of place with the mood of the day. Martha Quill stood behind the counter, A sturdy woman with kind eyes and an expression that missed nothing. Cole, thought the rain might have washed you away. Not yet, he said, handing her his list. Flour, salt, coffee, beans, cartridges. As she gathered the items, a low murmur of conversation drifted from the men gathered around the pot-belly stove, the only source of real warmth in the place. Cole caught a few words. Crossing Hollow, preacher's son, a runaway bride. His focus sharpened. He moved closer, pretending to inspect a display of new axe handles. $50. One man, a rancher named Silas, was saying, "That's what Deacon Hale is offering, alive or dead." What did she do? Exactly, another asked. Stabbed the boy. Jedediah Hale, on his wedding night, no less, Silas said, his voice full of righteous indignation. The deacon says she's a Jezebel, possessed of a wicked spirit, ran off into the wilderness. A poster, damp and slightly wrinkled, was tacked to the wall by the door. Cole's blood ran cold. It was a crude notice, the word stark and brutal. It described a young woman with dark hair, wanted for assault. $50. He read the name at the bottom, Deacon Abel Hale, the preacher's brother. Just then, the door opened again and Deputy Finch walked in, shaking the rain from his hat. He was young, with a fresh face and an air of self-importance that his dusty badge had not yet earned him. He saw Cole and his expression brightened. "Mercer, just the man I wanted to see," he said, striding over. "You run that spread that borders the Hollow Lands, don't you?" "My fence is on the line," Cole said, his voice carefully non-committal. "Heard anything unusual? Seen anyone passing through in the last few days? We're looking for a girl." Finch gestured to the poster. "Caused a whole mess of trouble over in Crossing Hollow. Deacon Hale is mighty upset. Says she's a danger to the community." Cole met the deputy's earnest, searching gaze. The oath he had made to himself, the vow of non-involvement, screamed in his head. This was his chance to walk away, to turn her over, to be free of the trouble she represented. He thought of her sleeping with a knife in her hand, of the raw fear in her eyes, of the quiet way she had held his mother's book of poetry. He shook his head, his expression as bland as he could make it. "Haven't seen a soul," he said, the lie feeling heavy and solid on his tongue. Just the wind and the rain. Finch looked disappointed, but nodded. "Well, keep your eyes open. $50 is a lot of money." Cole paid Martha for his supplies, his movements stiff. She looked at him, her gaze sharp and knowing, but she said nothing as she handed him his change. He packed his saddlebags, and on his way out, he paused by the wanted poster, with a quick, seamless movement. While the other men were distracted by a fresh pot of coffee, he plucked it from the wall, folded it, and slipped it into his coat pocket. He did not ride straight back to the line cabin. Instead, he stopped at the blacksmith's forge on the edge of town, the smithy. A burly man named Gus was busy at the anvil and only grunted a hello. The air was hot and thick with the smell of coal smoke and hot metal. Cole walked over to the forge, the heart of the building, where a bed of coals glowed with a furious, orange light. He stood there for a long moment, the heat washing over his face. He thought of the promise he had made to Daniel's grave, a promise of peace, of solitude. He thought of the lie he had just told the law. He had chosen a side. He pulled the folded poster from his pocket. He did not read it again. He opened the small iron door of the forge and tossed the paper inside. It landed on the glowing coals and hesitated for a second, the black ink stark against the white paper. Then the edges began to curl and blacken. A small tongue of flame licked out, and in a heartbeat, the paper, the words, the $50 reward, were consumed, turning into a wisp of gray ash that danced up into the chimney and vanished into the rain-soaked sky. He had made a silent declaration of war. The rain stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving behind a world washed clean and shining under a tentative sun. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and sagebrush. The end of the rain did not bring relief, only a new kind of tension. The mud would dry, the roads would clear, and the men who were looking for Ada would be able to travel again. The fragile sanctuary of the line cabin had become a trap. Cole knew he could not keep her hidden forever. Hiding was a temporary solution. A pause, not a plan. By burning the poster, he had committed himself to her fight, and that meant she had to be able to fight for herself. He was not offering her protection anymore. He was offering her a chance at survival. The morning after his trip to town, he took her outside. He carried his rifle and a small pistol he rarely used. He led her to a shallow ravine behind the cabin, a place where the sound would be muffled and stray shots would be safely absorbed by the earth. He started with the rifle. "This is a Winchester," he said, his voice all business. He showed her how to hold it, how to brace the stock against her shoulder, how to sight down the long barrel. You do not just point. You breathe. You squeeze. You become still. He set up a tin can on a rock 50 yards away. When he handed her the rifle, the weight of it surprised her. Her arms trembled. Her first shot went wide, kicking up a puff of dirt a full 10 feet to the left of the can. The recoil slammed the stock into her shoulder, making her cry out and stumble backward. Frustration and fear warred on her face. "I cannot," she said, her voice tight. "You will," he said, his own voice unyielding. Again. She reloaded, her movements clumsy. He watched her, seeing the tremor in her hands, but also seeing something new harden in her eyes. It was a cold, sharp resolve. She was not a woman who would be a victim twice. She set her feet, took a deep breath just as he had shown her, and squeezed the trigger. The shot was still wide, but closer. They spent the entire morning like that. Shot after shot echoed in the ravine. By noon, her shoulder was a mass of bruises and her hands were scraped. But she was hitting the can 3 times out of 5. The trembling was gone, replaced by a steady, focused competence. In the afternoons, he taught her about horses, not the gentle, side-saddle riding of a town lady, but the hard, practical riding of the frontier. He taught her to mount from either side, to guide the horse with the pressure of her knees, to stay seated during a fast gallop over uneven ground. He made her saddle and unsaddle his horse until her fingers were raw, until she could do it in the dark. He was a demanding teacher, offering no praise, only corrections. He was not teaching her a skill. He was forging her a weapon. Escape was a weapon. During one of these lessons, while they were repairing a worn stirrup leather, she revealed a skill of her own. Cole was struggling to make a clean cut with his larger utility knife. Without a word, Ada held out her hand. He passed her the leather. She drew the small knife she always carried, the one she had held in her fist that first day in the creek bed, with a single, smooth motion. She drew the blade along the leather. The cut was perfect, as straight and clean as if it had been drawn with a ruler. Cole looked from the perfectly cut leather to the knife in her hand. It was not a simple paring knife. He realized now. The handle was worn smooth, but the blade was of fine steel, expertly honed. It was a tool made for precise work, and she wielded it with an unconscious, practiced grace. He felt a new level of respect for her. That knife was not just a symbol of her fear. It was an extension of her will. He nodded, took the leather from her, and did not ask where she had learned to use a blade like that. Some questions had no place in the fragile trust they were building. A few days later, a restlessness took hold of Cole. He needed perspective, a voice that was not his own internal argument. He told Ada he was riding out to check his southern fence line and that he would be gone most of the day. He rode south, but he did not stop at the fence. He continued on, into the low, rolling hills that marked the edge of his property, toward a place where a thin tendril of smoke usually rose against the sky. He found Thomas Gray sitting outside his dugout home, braiding a horsehair rope. The old scout was a fixture of the landscape, a man who seemed to be made of the same sun-baked earth and gnarled wood as the territory itself. His face was a map of his long life, his eyes holding the wisdom of both the white man's world and the native one he had been born into. He was Cole's only real friend, a man with whom silence was as comfortable as conversation. Thomas looked up as Cole approached, his gaze taking in everything from the tension in Cole's shoulders to the new set of his jaw. "You look like a man who has found something he was not looking for," Thomas said, his voice a low rumble. Cole dismounted and accepted the cup of water Thomas offered. "Just things on my mind." "Things or a person?" the old man asked, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Cole did not answer directly. He stared out at the vast, empty prairie. "I made a promise to myself, to stay clear of other people's troubles." "That is a promise a man makes to a ghost," Thomas said quietly. "The living have a way of not listening." He tested the strength of his new rope. "You cannot stand on a riverbank and tell the water not to flow. You either build a bridge, or you get your feet wet." He looked at Cole, his gaze direct and piercing. "You must be careful, Cole. When you choose to stand with a person, you are also choosing your battlefield." The words settled deep in Cole's gut, a hard kernel of truth. He had already chosen. He had gotten his feet wet the moment he carried her out of that creek. He was on her battlefield now, whether he liked it or not. He thanked Thomas and rode back to the cabin with a heavier, but clearer, mind. As he neared the cabin, he smelled it, a scent that was utterly foreign to his solitary life, the smell of cooking that was not his own. He found Ada by the stove, stirring a small pot. She had found a patch of wild onions growing by the shed and had added them to the beans. It was a simple thing, but the aroma changed the entire character of the cabin. It was no longer just a shelter. For a fleeting moment, it felt like a home. The sight of her there, focused on her task, the faint light from the window catching in her dark hair, caused a strange tightening in his chest. The quiet moment was shattered 2 days later. He was chopping wood when he saw them. 2 riders silhouetted against the morning sky, coming from the east. They were not cowboys. They rode with the slumped, watchful posture of men who were hunting, not herding. "Inside," he said to Ada in a low, urgent voice. "Now?" He did not have to explain. She saw the look on his face and scrambled into the cabin, the root cellar. "Stay there until I come for you. Do not make a sound." He followed her in, lifted the heavy trap door in the floor, and watched her descend into the cool darkness. He lowered the door, kicked a dusty rug over it, and was back outside, leaning on his axe handle. By the time the riders reached his yard, there were 2 of them, both with hard, greedy eyes and guns tied low on their hips. "Morning," the taller one said, his gaze sweeping over the cabin, the barn, the empty corral. "Looking for a runaway? A young woman, dark hair. You seen anyone like that?" "No one here but me," Cole said, his voice flat. He leaned on the axe, his knuckles white. "Funny," the second man said. "Dismounting. We heard she came this way. There is a $50 reward. A man could be tempted to hide that kind of money for himself." The man started walking toward the cabin. Cole stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "That is my house. You are not invited." The man's hand drifted toward his pistol. "We are just going to have a look around. Make sure you are not lying to us." Cole did not move. He just stared at the man, his eyes as cold and hard as river stones. "If you take one more step, I will bury this axe in your chest." He said it not as a threat, but as a simple statement of what would happen next. The bounty hunter hesitated. He looked at Cole's face, at the absolute certainty in his eyes, and he saw a man who was not bluffing. He saw a man who had drawn a line in the dirt, a line he was willing to die for. He looked at his partner, who shrugged. $50 was not worth dying for. "Have it your way, rancher," the first man sneered from his horse. "But we will be back, and we will be watching." They turned their horses and rode away, their backs rigid with anger. Cole waited until they were a distant speck on the horizon before he moved. His hands were shaking. He went inside and opened the trap door. "They are gone." Ada climbed out, her face pale and streaked with dirt from the cellar. He expected to see relief or fear. He did not expect to see the rage that blazed in her eyes.
"So I am to spend my life hiding in holes in the ground," she spat, her voice trembling with fury. "Listening while you decide if my life is worth a fight. I wanted to hear the sound of his skull breaking. I wanted him to die."
Her breath hitched, and a sob tore from her throat. The confession she had held back for so long came pouring out, a torrent of shame and fury. "It was my wedding night," she whispered, her gaze fixed on some horror only she could see. He locked the door. He told me what a husband was owed, what God expected of me. She shuddered, wrapping her arms around herself. He was smiling. I knew what was coming. He thought because the preacher had said the words, he owned me, he put his hands on me, and I felt something break inside. I saw the little knife he had used to peel an apple for me earlier that day, sitting on the nightstand. Her voice grew stronger, harder. I was not going to be a piece of property he could damage and then discard. I grabbed it. I told him to stay away. He laughed. He thought it was a joke, so I showed him it was not. She looked up at Cole, her eyes brilliant with unshed tears. "They call me a wicked woman. They say I shamed him, but all I did was refuse to be broken." She stood before him, stripped bare of everything but her painful, defiant truth. She expected judgment, disgust, perhaps even pity. Cole looked at her, at the fierce, desperate pride on her face, at the memory of trauma that still haunted her eyes. He did not see a sinner or a victim. He saw a survivor, the shard of rock under his ribs, the one that had tormented him for years with the memory of his failure. Seemed to dissolve. He had not been there for Daniel, but he was here now, for her. He took a step closer, and his voice was rough with an emotion he could not name. "You are still standing," he said. "That is enough." Her confession hung in the air of the small cabin long after the words were spoken, a truth that had scrubbed the space clean of all pretense. Cole's simple affirmation, "You are still standing. That is enough," had not erased her past, but it had validated her survival. It was a foundation, the first solid piece of ground she had stood upon in weeks. But solid ground in a known location was a liability. The bounty hunters had promised to return, and Cole knew they were not the kind of men to make idle threats. His small ranch was no longer a refuge. It was a target. "They will be back," he said the next morning, his voice low as he stared out the window at the vast, watchful prairie. "They will scout from the ridges, wait until they think we are careless." Ada was cleaning the tin plates from their sparse breakfast. "So we wait for them?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. There was no tremor in it now, no hint of the panicked girl from the creek bed. "No," Cole said. "Waiting is a fool's game. We give them nothing to find." He turned from the window, his plan already formed. "There is a box canyon in the northwest corner of my land. Good water, good grass, and only one way in or out. I can move the herd there, and they will be out of sight. We will go with them. It is rough country. No one will look for us there." It was not a question. It was a statement of their new reality. There was no Maury and you. There was only we. Ada simply nodded, her acceptance a silent pact between them. They spent the day preparing, packing what little they would need: dried beans, flour, coffee, a bedroll each, and ammunition. Cole worked with a grim efficiency, his every movement precise and purposeful. Ada matched his pace, her actions mirroring his, a quiet shadow of his competence. She packed the small, worn book of poetry, wrapping it carefully in a piece of oilcloth. It was the only piece of his world she had claimed, and he said nothing as he watched her stow it safely in her saddlebag. They started moving the small herd of cattle at dawn the next day. The sky was a strange, unsettling color, a pale, yellowish gray that offered no warmth. The air was heavy and still, the usual Wyoming wind having fallen into a dead calm, as if holding its breath. Cole kept looking up at the sky, his brow furrowed with a deep unease. "Something is not right," he muttered. more to himself than to her. "This is storm weather, but not a rain I have ever seen." They pushed the cattle hard, the animals themselves seeming to sense the wrongness in the air, moving with a low, nervous energy. By late afternoon, they were deep into the rugged hill country, the landscape a jagged collection of rocks and steep, scrub-covered slopes. The strange light had deepened, casting the world in an eerie, jaundiced glow. Then the temperature dropped. It was not a gradual cooling, but a sudden, shocking plunge, as if a door to a winter cellar had been thrown open. The air grew instantly, bitingly cold. A moment later, the first one hit. It struck the horn of Cole's saddle with a sharp crack, the sound of a stone hitting wood. It was a ball of ice the size of a pigeon's egg. Another hit the ground nearby. Then another. Within seconds, the air was filled with them. A hailstorm of a ferocity Cole had never witnessed descended upon them. A roaring, percussive assault. The cattle bellowed in panic and pain, trying to turn and run from the punishing barrage. The hailstones hammered down, striking their shoulders, their hats, their hands, with sharp, brutal impacts. To the trees Cole yelled over the deafening roar, pointing toward a small stand of pines on the other side of a wide, shallow creek. "We have to get to cover." He drove his horse forward, pushing the terrified cattle toward the water. Ada was right behind him, her face pale, her head bowed against the storm. They urged their horses into the creek. The water was not deep, only reaching to the horses' knees, but it was shockingly, unnervously cold, a torrent of melted ice. They were halfway across when Ada's horse, struck by a particularly large hailstone, screamed and reared. Ada, caught off guard, was thrown from the saddle, disappearing with a splash into the churning, icy water. Cole did not hesitate. He leaped from his own horse, the frigid water closing over his boots and soaking his jeans in an instant. The cold was a physical blow, stealing his breath and driving deep into his bones. He saw her surface, sputtering, her hair plastered to her face. She tried to stand, but the current was strong and her feet slipped on the slick rocks of the creek bed. He reached her in 2 long strides, his hands closing over her arms. He hauled her to her feet. She was soaked from head to toe, her dress clinging to her like a second skin, her body trembling violently, uncontrollably. The hailstones continued to rain down around them, peppering the surface of the water, striking them with punishing force.
"We have to move,"
he shouted, his words barely audible over the storm's fury. He put his arm around her waist, half lifting her, and forced their way through the rest of the creek. They stumbled onto the far bank and staggered toward the relative shelter of the pine trees. The thick branches absorbed some of the hail's impact, but they were already drenched, their clothes channeling the icy water directly to their skin. The wind, which had been absent all day, now returned with a vengeance. A razor-edged gale that cut through their wet clothes and turned the cold from a shock into a life-threatening danger. Ada's teeth were chattering so hard he could hear them. A deep, racking shudder went through her, a tremor that started in her core and shook her to her fingertips. Her lips were turning blue. Cole knew he had to get her warm, and he had to do it now. There was no time to build a fire, no time to find real shelter. He pushed her against the wide trunk of the largest pine tree, shielding her from the worst of the wind with his own body. He could feel the violent trembling of her frame against his chest. He was cold himself, a deep, seeping chill that was beginning to numb his fingers and toes. But her cold was different. It was the dangerous, systemic cold that could steal a person's life. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her tight against him, trying to force the warmth from his own body into hers. Her wet clothes were a barrier of ice between them. He held her closer, his arms like bands of steel, until her face was pressed into the rough wool of his coat, and he could feel every shudder that racked her body. She was so small, so fragile in his arms. He could feel the frantic, frightened beat of her heart against his ribs. He lowered his head, his lips close to her ear, his own voice a harsh, raw rasp against the howling of the storm. "You will catch a terrible cold," he warned. The words an absurd understatement for the danger they were in. She tilted her head back, her face streaked with rain and melted hail. She was soaked and shivering, a picture of misery. But her eyes, when they met his, were not filled with fear. They were clear, and in their depths, a small, resilient flame was burning. The furious survivor was still there, but now there was something else, something soft and warm. A small, miraculous smile touched her lips, a gesture of pure, unadulterated warmth in the midst of the freezing gale. "Only if you let go," she replied, her voice barely a whisper, yet the words landed with more force than the hail. It was not a challenge or a demand. It was a surrender. It was a plea for shelter and an offering of trust so complete it stunned him. In that moment, the careful distance he had maintained between them, the wall of his own making, crumbled to dust. He had been holding her to save her life. Now, he was just holding her. The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a bruised and battered world. They found a small overhang of rock, a shallow cave that offered a roof and a dry floor. Cole gathered what dry wood he could find from the underside of fallen logs, and with numb, clumsy fingers, he managed to start a small, sputtering fire. The warmth was a blessing, a fragile miracle against the encroaching cold. They huddled close to it, their clothes steaming in the heat. There was no room for distance in the small space, no room for pretense. He took his knife and cut the strips of cloth from her feet, which were now numb and white. He rubbed them briskly between his hands, forcing the blood and life back into them, his touch gentle but firm. She watched him, her expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. When he was done, she reached out and took his hands in hers. They were scraped and raw from the hail. She said nothing, but her touch was a balm, a quiet acknowledgement of his own pain. He had only one dry blanket in his bedroll. He shook it out and, without a word, draped it over both their shoulders. They sat side by side, cocooned in the rough wool, their shoulders touching, their legs pressed together for warmth. The fire crackled, the only sound in the vast, dripping silence of the aftermath. He could feel the warmth returning to her, the violent shudders subsiding into a faint tremor. He was acutely aware of every point of contact between their bodies, of the soft weight of her head as it eventually came to rest against his shoulder. He wanted to put his arm around her, to pull her closer, to offer the simple comfort of a human embrace. But he could not. The memory of her confession, of a locked door and a man who thought he owned her, was a stark and vivid presence between them. To hold her now, to take a comfort she had not explicitly offered, felt like a violation. It felt like another claim, another cage, no matter how well-intentioned. He was terrified of becoming another man who took something from her, even if it was only a moment of solace. Ada, for her part, leaned into his warmth, a part of her craving the simple, uncomplicated security of his presence. He had not judged her. He had taught her to fight. He had stood between her and danger. She felt safer with him than she had ever felt in her life, but a deeper, more wounded part of her recoiled. She had paid a terrible price for a man's touch once before. She was afraid that to accept this comfort, to lean into this warmth, was to create a new kind of debt, a new expectation she would be forced to meet. They sat there for a long time in the shared silence, each trapped in their own conflict, yet deeply aware of the other's. He did not move to hold her tighter. She did not pull away. They had chosen, without a word, to slow down, to let this fragile new thing between them find its own pace. Finally, her hand, which had been resting on her lap, moved, slowly, hesitantly. She reached out and laid her trembling fingers on top of his hand where it rested on his knee. It was not a grip, just a light, questioning touch. He responded by turning his hand over and gently closing his fingers around hers. Their hands, scraped and bruised and cold, found a simple, uncomplicated warmth in each other's grasp. It was not a solution to their fears, but it was an answer. It was a silent treaty, an agreement to stand together in the quiet aftermath of the storm. Outside, the world dripped and settled. Inside their small shelter, the fire burned low, the flames sinking into a bed of soft, glowing embers that pulsed with a quiet, enduring heat. The days they spent in the box canyon were a strange interlude, a pocket of quiet stolen from a world that was hunting them. The cattle grew placid, and a fragile sense of domesticity settled over Cole and Ada. They worked in a shared rhythm, their movements economical and understood, their silences no longer fraught with suspicion but filled with a comfortable, unspoken awareness. The hand he had taken in the rock shelter had not been released. Not truly. The space between them had changed, collapsing from a chasm of fear and duty into a narrow, charged distance of mutual respect and a warmth that neither dared to name. They knew the peace could not last. On the third day, Cole rode to a high ridge to scout, and he saw what he had been expecting, the faint signature of a distant campfire. Miles to the east, in the direction of Crossing Hollow, they were being watched. The wolves were circling. "We have to go back," he said when he returned, his face grim. "They expect us to stay hidden. They will not expect us to walk back into the open." It was a dangerous gamble, a move born of the belief that the boldest path was sometimes the safest. They returned to the ranch house under the cover of darkness, the familiar shapes of the barn and the corral offering a comfort that was thin and treacherous. The house felt different now, no longer a fortress of solitude, but a shared, vulnerable space. The attack came not at dawn, as he would have expected, but in the brazen heat of the following afternoon. They came as a posse, not as stealthy hunters, their arrival announced by the deliberate, arrogant drumbeat of approaching horses. Cole was in the barn, mending a harness. When he heard them, he stepped to the door and saw them, a dark knot of 6 riders cresting the small rise that overlooked his home. At their head was a man in a black coat, his face a mask of grim piety. Even from a distance, Cole recognized the rigid, unforgiving posture of Deacon Abel Hale. "Ada," Cole's voice was low, but it cut through the still afternoon air. "Inside the house. Bar the door. Stay away from the windows." She was already moving, her face pale but her eyes clear and focused. She disappeared into the house, the solid thud of the crossbar falling into place a moment later. Cole took his rifle from the hooks just inside the barn door, checked the action, and stepped out into the yard. He stood in the open, the rifle held loosely in his hands, and waited. Deacon Hale and his 5 men reined in their horses a few yards away. Forming a grim semicircle, they were a mix of hard-faced ranch hands from Crossing Hollow and 2 men Cole recognized as the bounty hunters from before. "Cole Mercer," the deacon's voice was as cold and hard as a tombstone. "We have come on the Lord's work. You are harboring a sinner, a fugitive from righteous justice. Hand the girl over to us." "This is my land," Cole said, his voice quiet but carrying in the tense silence. "The girl is under my protection. You have no business here." "I have God's business here," Hale retorted, his eyes burning with a zealot's fire. "That woman is a vessel of corruption. She laid hands on my nephew, a servant of the Lord, and shamed him. She will be brought back and she will be purified." One of the younger men with Hale laughed, a coarse, ugly sound. "Purified. That is a good one. Deacon." Hale's glare silenced him. "We will have her, Mercer, one way or another. You can give her to us, or we can burn this barn to the ground with your livestock inside it." The threat hung in the air, thick and oily. Cole's gaze flickered to the barn. It was more than just a building. It was the product of his father's hands, the place where he and Daniel had learned to be men. It was the last physical piece of his family he had left. Before Cole could answer, the door to the house creaked open. Ada stepped out onto the porch, her small knife held tightly in her hand. Her face was ashen, but she stood straight, her chin high.
"Stop!"
she said, her voice clear and strong. "This is not your fight. I will go with you." She started to walk down the porch steps, her eyes fixed on Deacon Hale, a lamb walking toward the slaughter to save the shepherd. Cole saw the flicker of triumphant cruelty in Hale's eyes. He saw the leering smiles on the faces of his men. He saw the barn, his past, and Ada, his present, and a rage so pure and cold it felt like ice filled his veins. He moved, in the space of a heartbeat. He closed the distance to the youngest of Hale's men, the one who had laughed. He did not use the barrel of his rifle, but the stock, he swung it in a short, brutal arc, catching the man squarely on the side of the head. The man crumpled from his saddle like a sack of grain, hitting the dirt with a heavy thud. In the same motion, Cole spun, jacked around into the chamber of the Winchester, and fired. Not at a man, but into the ground just in front of the deacon's horse. The dirt exploded, and the horse screamed and reared, throwing the deacon off balance. Chaos erupted. The bounty hunters clawed for their guns. Cole fired again, the bullet splintering the top rail of the fence near one of them, driving him to seek cover. A pistol shot rang out, then another. The air was suddenly thick with the smell of gunpowder and the whine of ricocheting lead. Cole dived behind the water trough, the wood splintering above his head as a bullet slammed into it. He fired back, his movements economical and deadly. He was not aiming to kill. Not yet. He was aiming to drive them back, to show them that this piece of land would cost them more blood than they were willing to spill. But they were desperate. Their greed and self-righteousness, a potent combination. They spread out, using the fence posts and a pile of old lumber for cover, and the gunfight became a deadly, static exchange. Cole was pinned down. He risked a glance over the edge of the trough and saw one of the bounty hunters crawling toward the side of the barn, trying to get a flanking angle. Cole fired, forcing the man back. But as he did, he felt a sharp, stinging pain in his left arm. He looked down and saw a line of red soaking through his sleeve. A bullet had grazed him. Then he saw the real threat. One of Hale's men, a thin, weaselly man, had not joined the main fight. He had slipped away unnoticed and was now positioned behind a large boulder on the small rise. 100 yards away, he had a rifle, and he was taking careful, deliberate aim at Cole's exposed position. He was the sniper. Cole saw the glint of the sun on the rifle barrel. He knew he could not move, could not even duck, without exposing himself completely. He was trapped. He saw the man settle the stock against his shoulder, and he braced himself for the impact. He did not see Ada move. He did not know she had crept from the porch to the corner of the house. All he saw was a flash of movement in his peripheral vision, a small, dark object arcing through the air. It was not a thought, but a pure, physical reaction, born of countless hours of practice and a desperate, burning need to protect. Ada's arm snapped forward, her body uncoiling like a spring. The small, perfectly balanced knife flew from her hand, a flicker of deadly steel turning end over end. It seemed to hang in the air for an impossible moment. Then it dropped. The man behind the boulder grunted, a sound of pained surprise. He stood up, his rifle discharging into the sky. He had a look of utter disbelief on his face. The handle of Ada's knife protruded from his throat. He took one staggering step forward, his hands clawing at his neck, and then he collapsed behind the rock. The sudden, shocking silence was more deafening than the gunfire had been. The remaining men stared at the spot where their sniper had fallen. They looked at the house, at the small, fierce woman who now stood in the open, her empty hands at her sides. They looked at Cole, who was now rising from behind the trough, his rifle leveled, his face a mask of cold fury. The fight went out of them. One man was down, another was dead. The rancher was wounded but still fighting. And the girl was something else entirely. The bounty hunters were the first to break. One of them scrambled onto his horse and spurred it into a gallop, riding away without a backward glance. His partner was right behind him, Deacon Hale. his face white with rage and shock, screamed a curse at them, then at Cole.
"This is not over, Mercer. You will burn for this. You will both burn."
He hauled his horse around and galloped after his fleeing men, leaving his unconscious crony lying in the dust. The silence that descended on the yard was absolute. There was only the sound of the wind, the panicked lowing of a cow in the barn, and the ragged sound of their own breathing. Cole walked over to where the young man lay moaning on the ground. He nudged him with his boot. "Get on your horse and get off my land. Tell the deacon that if I ever see any of you again, I will not aim for the ground." The man scrambled to his feet, clutching his head, and stumbled to his horse, riding away as fast as he could. Cole stood alone in the yard, his rifle hanging from his hand. Ada slowly walked toward him, her eyes fixed on the red stain spreading on his sleeve. He looked at her, then at the boulder on the hill, then back to her. 1,000 things needed to be said, but no words came. That night, they sat in the dark house, the lantern unlit, listening to the sounds of the prairie. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and the cold, hard reality of what they had done. They were no longer just fugitives. They were killers. It was Ada who saw it first, a faint, flickering orange glow on the horizon. "Cole," she whispered. He went to the window and looked out. The glow was coming from the direction of the barn. As they watched, it grew brighter, angrier. A tongue of flame leaped up into the night sky. Then another. He ran outside, Ada close behind him. The barn was fully engulfed, a roaring inferno that painted the night sky in hellish shades of orange and red. The heat was so intense they could feel it from the yard. There was nothing he could do. His livestock, his tools, the old trunk in the loft that held his mother's book of poetry and his father's letters. Everything. It was all turning to ash. It was Hale's revenge, a spiteful, cowardly act of destruction. He stood there, motionless, watching his past burn away. The firelight danced in his eyes, reflecting a pain that went deeper than any bullet wound. Ada came to stand beside him. She saw the devastation on his face, the loss of a history she had only just begun to understand. A wave of guilt, so powerful it threatened to drown her, washed over her. All of this, the violence, the death, this terrible final loss was because of her. "This is my fault," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. "All of this, it is because you took me in." Cole did not look at her. He continued to stare into the heart of the fire, at the collapsing roof and the shower of embers rising into the wind. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, scoured clean by the smoke and the sorrow. "No," he said. He turned and looked at her then, his eyes clear and certain in the flickering firelight. "This is not your fault." He reached out and took her hand, his grip firm and sure. "This is my choice." She looked at their joined hands, then up at his face. In the light of the flames, she saw the end of his solitude. He had made his choice, and he had paid the price for it. She tightened her grip, her fingers lacing with his. They stood together, two solitary figures against the roaring blaze, and watched the last of his old life burn away into the vast, dark Wyoming night. The price had been paid. The dawn that broke over the smoldering ruins of the barn was gray and cold. The air tasted of ash. They stood in the yard, two solitary figures in a landscape of loss. The blackened timbers of his past a stark testament to the price of his choice. The scent of wet, charred wood was the smell of an ending. Cole looked at the ruins, then at Ada, her face smudged with soot, her eyes reflecting the bleak morning light. Running was over. Hiding was over. A fire could chase you from a building, but it could not chase you from the truth. "We are not running anymore," he said, his voice a low rasp. "We ride into town. We finish this." It was not a question. It was the only path left that was not a retreat. To flee now would be to admit guilt, to validate Hale's brand of fiery, self-serving justice. To flee would be to let the fire win. Ada looked at the hand he still held, then up to his face. She saw no doubt there, only a hard, settled resolve that was as unyielding as the mountains on the horizon. She nodded. They rode together, not on separate horses as they had before, but with Ada seated behind him on his sturdy buckskin. Her horse had bolted during the hailstorm and was gone. The arrangement was one of necessity, but it felt like something more. Her arms were wrapped around his waist, her cheek resting against the solid plane of his back. For the first time, she was not just a companion in survival, but a partner, moving with him, a shared presence against a hostile world. Their arrival in Wayfarer's Rest was a quiet cataclysm. The town, usually a place of slow, deliberate motion, froze as they rode down the muddy main street. Hammers fell silent at the smithy. Women paused with their market baskets, their conversations dying on their lips. Men stepped out of the saloon, wiping their mouths on their sleeves, their eyes narrowed and curious. They were a spectacle, a hard-faced man with a fresh bullet wound on his arm, and a woman whose name had been whispered in scandal for weeks, clinging to him as if he were the last solid thing on earth. Deputy Finch was the first to move, stepping into the street to block their path, his hand resting uncertainly on the butt of his pistol. His young face was a mixture of confusion and official duty.
"Mercer," he said, his voice tight. "What is the meaning of this? People are saying there was a gunfight at your ranch. A man is dead."
Before Cole could answer, a second group of riders entered the town from the opposite end. It was Deacon Hale and 3 of his men, their faces grim, their horses lathered from a hard ride. Hale's eyes, when they fell on Cole and Ada, were alight with a triumphant, venomous fire.
"There he is,"
Deputy Hale's voice boomed. A preacher's voice meant to fill a church, now filling the 10th Street. "The murderer and his harlot. He harbors a fugitive and spills righteous blood to do it. I demand you arrest this man." A crowd was gathering now, drawn by the confrontation, their faces a mixture of fear and morbid fascination. Cole swung down from his horse, then reached up to help Ada dismount. He kept her hand in his, standing before the deputy and the deacon as a single, unmovable unit. "There was a fight," Cole said, his voice calm and even, cutting through Hale's bluster. "Because this man and his hired guns came onto my land and threatened to burn me out. They were the ones who broke the law." Lies Hale roared. "He protects this Jezebel, this creature who defiled my nephew, an innocent boy." A new voice, clear and steady, cut through the noise. "That boy has not been innocent a day in his life. Abel Hale." The crowd parted. Martha Quill, the owner of the general store, stood on the boardwalk, her arms crossed over her chest. Her gaze was fixed on the deacon, and it held no fear. "I have seen the way Jedediah Hale looks at women," she said, her voice ringing with authority, "like they are items on a shelf for him to sample. He has a sickness in his eyes, and the whole town of Crossing Hollow pretends not to see it because his father speaks from the pulpit." A murmur went through the crowd. A few of the other women nodded, their expressions tight with a shared, unspoken knowledge. One of them, the blacksmith's wife, spoke up, her voice trembling but clear. "He cornered my daughter behind the church last spring." She was afraid to say anything. Deacon Hale's face turned a mottled shade of purple. Silence. "You gossiping hens, you dare to slander a good Christian boy." "I dare to speak the truth," Martha Quill said, "which is more than can be said for you." "I can speak to the girl's condition," another man said reluctantly. It was Dr. Ellery, who had been on his way to his buggy. He looked deeply uncomfortable, a man of science caught in a storm of emotion. He would not meet Cole's eye, nor Hale's, but stared at a point somewhere in the muddy street. When she first arrived here, she was suffering from exhaustion and had several bruises and scratches consistent with a physical struggle. I did not ask the cause. It was not my place. The foundation of Hale's righteous anger was beginning to crack, eroded by the quiet, persistent truth of decent people. Deputy Finch looked from the deacon's furious face to Cole's steady one, his own certainty wavering. "This is a legal matter," a new voice of authority announced. A portly, gray-haired man in a dusty but well-made suit stepped forward. It was Circuit Judge Miller, a man who passed through Wayfarer's Rest twice a year to dispense the territory's justice. "And I will not have it settled with shouting in the street." He looked at Cole, then at Ada, then at Hale. "I have heard enough to know this requires a hearing. We will have it now. The saloon will do." He turned to the deputy. "Finch, you will maintain order." The saloon was transformed from a place of leisure into a makeshift courtroom. The tables were pushed to the walls, and the townspeople crowded in, their faces grim and expectant. Judge Miller set himself up behind the bar, the rows of whiskey bottles his backdrop. Deacon Hale and his men stood on one side, Cole and Ada on the other. It was a trial of the frontier, raw and immediate, with the weight of community opinion as powerful as any law book. Deacon Hale spoke first, his voice filled with biblical fury. He painted a picture of a virtuous, innocent boy, a loving family, and a wicked, seductive woman who had lured him in only to attack him without provocation. He spoke of sin and shame, of the sanctity of a marriage vow that had been defiled. He was a powerful speaker, and some in the crowd nodded along, caught up in the rhythm of his condemnation. When he was finished, Judge Miller looked at Cole. "Mr. Mercer, your response." Cole took a step forward. He did not raise his voice. He did not look at the crowd. He looked directly at the judge. "I was not there when it happened," he said, his voice clear and cold. "So I cannot speak to that. I can only speak to what I saw. I found a young woman, barefoot and terrified, who had run for her life. And I can speak to what happened yesterday. This man, Deacon Hale, came to my home with 5 armed men. They threatened my life and my property. They fired first. A man died because of their greed and their hate." He paused, and his gaze swept over Hale. "He speaks of righteousness, but a locked door is a cage, and striking a woman is not a righteous act." He stepped back. A heavy silence filled the room. His words were simple, stark, and they resonated with a truth that was deeper than any sermon. The judge looked at Ada. She was pale, but her hands were steady at her sides. "Miss Barn," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle, "do you have anything to say in your own defense?" Ada took a deep breath. This was her moment, her battlefield. She stepped forward, away from the protective shadow of Cole's body. She stood alone in the center of the room, and her gaze met the dozens of pairs of eyes that were fixed on her. "My name is Ada Byrne," she began, her voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the saloon. "What that man says is a lie, but I want you all to understand something. I'm not an innocent child. I knew what Jedediah Hale wanted from me. I knew what kind of man he was. I went to that wedding with my eyes open, hoping I could endure it, hoping I could find some small piece of a life for myself." Her voice grew stronger, shedding its tremor, gaining a core of steel. "But on that night, he locked the door. He told me that my life was no longer my own. He told me that my body belonged to him, to do with as he pleased. He was wrong." She looked directly at Deacon Hale, her eyes blazing with a fire that made him flinch. "I did not attack an innocent boy. I defended myself from a man who was trying to break me. I am not ashamed of what I did. He gave me 2 choices that night: to be a victim or to fight, and I chose to live." She finished, her chest rising and falling, the truth of her words hanging in the thick, smoky air. No one moved. No one spoke. In that moment, she was not a harlot or a Jezebel. She was a woman who had claimed her own story. Judge Miller looked at her for a long time, his expression unreadable. Then he looked at Hale, whose face was a mask of thwarted rage. He banged his hand on the wooden bar, the sound making everyone jump. "I have heard enough," he announced. "This is not a court of saints and sinners. This is a court of law, such as it is in this territory. And the law allows for a person to defend themselves against a threat of grievous harm." He looked out at the silent crowd. Based on the testimony of Dr. Ellery and the other women of this town, I find it credible that Miss Byrne had reason to fear such harm. He fixed his gaze on Deacon Hale. As for the events at the Mercer Ranch, it sounds to me like you and your men were trespassing, and that Mr. Mercer acted in defense of his own life and property. The death of your man is a tragedy, but it is a tragedy of your own making. He took a deep breath and delivered his verdict. On the charge of assault, I find Miss Ada Byrne not guilty. A collective gasp went through the room, followed by a wave of murmurs. Martha Quill had tears in her eyes. Cole felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled his knees. He reached out and took Ada's hand. But Judge Miller was not finished. He looked at Cole and Ada, and his expression was grim. But I am a practical man. The deacon here has influence, and he has a long memory. The law may find you innocent, but that will not keep you safe. Wayfarers rest. This whole territory is not a safe place for you anymore. He leaned forward, his voice dropping. My advice to you both is to take this victory and ride. Ride west. Do not look back. The relief of the verdict was instantly chilled by the hard reality of the judge's words. They had won. They had been vindicated. But they had also been exiled. Deacon Hale pushed his way through the crowd, his face contorted in a mask of pure hatred. This is not over, he hissed as he passed them. God's justice will find you. Cole and Ada stood together in the middle of the saloon, the crowd slowly parting around them. They had faced down the law. They had faced down the mob. And they had won. But their home was a pile of ashes, and the only path forward was a road leading away into the vast, unknown wilderness of the West. The aftermath of the verdict was not a celebration, but a quiet, somber dismantling of a life. The crowd in the saloon dispersed, leaving Cole and Ada standing in a sudden, echoing silence. They had been declared innocent, but the judgment had come with a sentence of exile. Wayfarers' Rest was no longer a place of shelter, however grudging. It was a place of ghosts and angry memories, a border they now had to cross. Their first stop was the land office, a small, dusty room presided over by a clerk who looked at them with a mixture of pity and fear. The sale of the Mercer Ranch was a swift, brutal transaction. The buyer, a rancher from the south end of the county who had always coveted Cole's access to water, knew he was in a position of power. The price he offered was an insult, a fraction of what the land and the house were worth. Even with the barn gone, Cole did not haggle. He looked at the deed, the paper that tied his name to the land his father had tamed, and he signed it without a word. He took the small pile of money, a meager compensation for a lifetime of work, and walked out. The clerk's hurried stamp on the document sounding like a final, slamming door. They spent the rest of the day gathering what little they would need for the road at the general store. Martha Quill met them with a sad, knowing smile. She filled their saddlebags with provisions, flour, bacon, coffee, and a small tin of her finest biscuits. She refused to take any of Cole's money. This town owes you more than this. Cole Mercer, she said, her voice low. It owes you an apology, but folks are scared. Hale has a long reach. While Cole was settling with the blacksmith for 2 new shoes for his horse, Ada approached Martha alone. She held out a small, worn leather pouch. It was the money Martha had secretly given her weeks ago, the funds that had been meant to help a lone woman escape. I cannot take this, Ada said quietly. You gave this to a runaway. I am not running anymore. Martha looked at the pouch, then at the young woman before her. She saw the new strength in Ada's shoulders, the clear, steady light in her eyes. You are right, Martha said, pushing the pouch gently back into Ada's hands. You are not running. You are starting over. Every new start needs a foundation. Let this be a small piece of yours. She closed Ada's fingers over the leather. Godspeed, child. Their final journey on the familiar land was back to the ranch, to the shell of a home that was no longer theirs. They moved through the landscape of their shared ordeal, past the creek where he had found her, past the ravine where he had taught her to shoot. The land itself seemed to be holding its breath, mourning their departure. At the ranch, Cole walked through the ruins of the barn, his boots crunching on the cooled ashes. He touched the stone foundation, still warm from the fire. He ran his hand over a charred fence post, a boundary marker that no longer had any meaning. He was saying goodbye, not just to a place, but to the man he had been, the solitary man who believed that straight fences could protect him from the messiness of the world. He went to the small, overgrown corner of the property where two simple wooden crosses stood, one for his father, one for his brother, Daniel. He stood there for a long time, the wind whispering through the tall grass. He was not the same man who had last stood in this spot, a man shackled by guilt and a failed promise. He had not been able to save his brother, but he had chosen to stand with Ada. He had chosen to fight. The wound of his past had not vanished, but it no longer had the power to paralyze him. As he was turning to leave, a rider approached. It was Thomas Gray, his weathered face as grim as the evening sky. He had seen the smoke, and he had come to see what was left. He dismounted and stood beside Cole, looking at the burned-out barn, his expression unreadable. "A fire cleanses," the old scout said finally. "It makes way for new growth. Or it just leaves scars," Cole replied. Thomas shook his head. "A scar is just a story written on the skin. You have a new story to write now." He handed Cole a heavy canvas bag. Inside was a large cut of dried venison and 2 full water skins. The land is wide to the west. The Green River country is good. Idaho has valleys where a man can disappear. He placed a hand on Cole's shoulder, a rare gesture of physical affection. "You did a good thing. Cole, do not let the wind decide where you go from here. You decide." He looked over at Ada, who was waiting patiently by the horses. He gave a slight, respectful nod. "You chose a strong partner," he said to Cole. "That is a better weapon than any rifle." With that, he mounted his horse and rode away, melting back into the landscape as if he were a part of it. That night, they camped for the last time on the land that had once been his. They built a small fire, a tiny spark of light against the immense, encroaching darkness. The sale of the ranch had left them with a decent horse, 2 good rifles, and enough money to start again, somewhere far away from the reach of Deacon Hale's hatred. They sat on opposite sides of the fire, the flames dancing between them. The silence was different tonight. It was not the comfortable silence of shared work, nor the tense silence of unspoken fears. It was a silence of anticipation, of a threshold waiting to be crossed. They had been through fire and flood, through violence and judgment. They had been forged into a partnership, a unit of survival. But as they sat there, on the precipice of a new, unknown life, a question lingered in the space between them. A question of what, exactly, they were to each other now. Ada was the one to finally give it a voice. She looked at him across the flickering flames, her face earnest and vulnerable. "Cole," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "After everything that has happened, everything I told you, do you still think I am pure?" The word hung in the air, a relic from another world, a world of locked doors and rigid expectations. It was the word men used to measure a woman's worth, a brand that could sanctify or condemn. She was asking him if her past, the violence she had endured and the violence she had committed, had tarnished her in his eyes. Cole looked at her, at the woman who had faced down a hailstorm, who had killed a man to save his life, who had stood before a hostile crowd and claimed her own truth without shame or apology. He thought of her quiet competence, her fierce resilience, the way she had held his mother's book of poetry with such reverence. He had spent years hiding from the world, believing that love and connection were dangers to be avoided, invitations to the kind of pain that had shattered his life. Ada had crashed through his fences, bringing chaos and violence. But she had also brought a fierce, unyielding life force that had woken him from his long, self-imposed slumber. He had tried to save her, and in doing so, he had saved himself. He loved her. The realization was not a sudden revelation, but a quiet, solid truth that settled into his bones as if it had always been there. It was not the simple, untested love of a young man, but the steady, clear-eyed love of a man who had seen the worst of the world and had found something worth fighting for. It was a love that had no room for simplistic labels like purity.
"No, Ada,"
he said, his voice rough with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. He looked directly into her eyes, letting her see the truth of his words. "I do not." He saw a flicker of pain, of disappointment, in her expression before he continued. "But I love you." The pain in her eyes vanished, replaced by a sudden, breathtaking wave of disbelief, then wonder, then a radiant, tearful joy. The 3 simple words he had spoken were more powerful than any verdict, more healing than any balm. They were an acceptance of everything. She was the survivor, the fighter, the woman who had chosen to live. He was not offering to save a fallen angel. He was offering his heart to an equal, a partner, a woman whose strength he admired and whose spirit he loved. He stood up, walked around the fire, and knelt in front of her. He took her hands in his. They were no longer trembling. "I love you," he said again, the words easier this time, truer, not because you are pure or innocent, or any of those other words that men use. "I love you because you are strong, and because you are true. I love you because you are still standing." She did not say anything. She simply leaned forward and pressed her forehead against his, her tears finally falling, hot and cleansing, onto their joined hands. The last of the old boundaries, the invisible fences of fear and duty and shame, had finally been pulled down. They were just 2 people, in the vast, empty heart of the West, choosing to build a new life, together. The fire had died to a bed of pale gray ash by the time the first hint of dawn touched the eastern sky. The confession and the declaration that had passed between them in the night had not been a fiery explosion, but a quiet, profound realignment, like a river finding its true and final course. They moved about the cold campsite with a new, unspoken intimacy, the space between them no longer a territory to be navigated with caution, but a shared ground of quiet understanding. He had not offered her absolution, and she had not asked for it. He had offered her love, a thing far more solid and sustaining. They packed what little they owned, their movements synchronized. He doused the last of the embers, erasing the final trace of their presence on the land that had defined his entire life. When everything was ready, he swung up onto his horse, then reached down for her. She took his hand without hesitation and settled behind him, her arms finding their now familiar place around his waist. He turned the horse's head to the west, toward the distant, unseen promise of the Idaho line and the Green River country Thomas Gray had spoken of. He did not look back at the scarred land, at the graves of his family, or at the town that had both condemned and vindicated them. The past was a landscape of ashes, and their faces were turned toward the rising sun. The journey west was a long, slow unwinding of the tension that had held them in its grip for weeks. The vast, empty plains of Wyoming gradually gave way to rolling hills and then to the formidable, saw-toothed spine of the mountains. They traveled with a quiet purpose, speaking little, but their silence was no longer a shield. It was a shared language. They learned to read the landscape together, his knowledge of tracking and survival blending with her keen, observant eye. He taught her how to read the stars, not as distant points of light, but as a map, a guide to carry them through the darkness. In the evenings, by the light of their small campfires, she would sometimes take out the small, oilcloth-wrapped book of his mother's poetry and read aloud, her voice a soft, steady anchor in the immense, wild silence. They were not pursued. The ghost of Deacon Hale's hatred was a long shadow that stretched behind them, but with every mile they traveled, it grew fainter. One afternoon, They saw a group of riders in the distance, and for a tense hour, the old fear returned. Cole had pulled them into the cover of a rocky outcrop, his hand resting on his rifle, his body instinctively shielding hers. But the riders passed without a glance in their direction, their forms eventually disappearing into the haze. When the danger had passed, Ada leaned her head against his back. "Do you think he will ever stop looking?" she asked, her voice a murmur against his coat. Cole thought for a long moment, watching the empty horizon where the riders had vanished. "A man like Hale feeds on the fear of others," he said finally. "We are no longer afraid, and we are no longer there. His hate will have to find a new place to live." He felt her relax behind him, her trust a warm, solid weight. They were no longer just running from something. They were riding towards something. The shape of that something began to form in their quiet conversations. Their dreams were not of wealth or ease, but of simple, tangible things. Promises spoken in the firelight that were as solemn as any vow. "When we find our place," she said one night, after they had shared a meal of dried venison and biscuits, "I will plant a garden, a proper one, with vegetables, and maybe some flowers, and I will find a patch of those wild onions. They have a good, strong taste." He smiled, picturing it. "And I will build a new barn," he said, his voice quiet, "a small one. At first, just big enough for a milk cow and a few horses. It will be made of fresh pine. It will smell of sawdust and new beginnings, not of smoke and endings." Another evening, as she was carefully repacking the worn book of poetry, he watched her, a thoughtful expression on his face. "That book needs a proper home," he said. "I will build you a bookshelf, or a small cabinet, with a door to keep the dust out. I will make it from cottonwood, and sand it until it is smooth as river stone. It will be the first thing I build, after the house." Ada looked at him, her eyes shining. The book was his last tangible link to his mother, and his desire to build a sanctuary for it was a promise to her that he was not just building a new life for himself, but for their shared future, a future that held a place for both of their pasts. They crossed the Green River at a shallow ford, the water clear and cold, washing the last of the Wyoming dust from their horses' hooves. They were in new territory now, a land of high mountain meadows and valleys carved by ancient glaciers. It was a land that felt younger, greener, more forgiving. They traveled for another week, moving with less urgency now, their journey becoming a search rather than a flight. They found it on a bright, clear morning. They had crested a high pass and looked down into a long, protected valley. A clear, fast-moving creek snaked through its center, its banks lined with aspen and willow. The valley floor was a carpet of lush grass, and the surrounding slopes were dotted with stands of tall pine. It was a place of quiet, immense beauty, a place a person could put down roots and not be easily found. It felt safe. It felt like a beginning. They rode down into the valley, the air sweet with the scent of pine and wild clover. They dismounted by the creek and let their horse drink, its long journey finally at an end. Cole scooped up a handful of the dark, rich earth and let it run through his fingers. It was good land. Ada walked a little way off, her eyes taking in the vast, beautiful emptiness. She looked at the mountains that stood like silent guardians around them, at the endless blue sky above. Here, the judgments of men like Deacon Hale and the whispers of frightened townspeople could not reach. Here, she was not a runaway or a sinner or a victim. She was just a woman, standing on a piece of earth that was waiting for a story to be written upon it. Her freedom was not something that had been granted to her by a judge in a saloon. It was something she had earned, something she could feel in the clean air she breathed. Cole came to stand beside her. He slipped his arm around her waist, and she leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the creek sparkle in the morning sun. He had once believed that justice was a clear, hard line, a fence to keep the bad out and the good in. He knew now that it was not so simple. Justice was not in the thunderous words from a pulpit or the cold letter of the law. It was in the quiet, difficult choice to stand with someone when the storm came. It was in the shared warmth of a single blanket against the freezing hail. He had thought love was a weakness, a vulnerability that would lead to ruin. He understood now that love, at least this kind of love, the kind forged in fire and fear, was the greatest strength of all. It was not a grand act of salvation. It was the simple, steady act of companionship. It was not a prize for the innocent, but a refuge for the responsible, for two people who had seen the darkness in the world and in themselves, and had chosen to face the light, together. They were not free from hardship. The coming winter would be hard, and the seeds of conflict Hale had planted might still send out runners across the wilderness. But they were no longer alone. They had learned to choose their battles, and they knew how to say way. As the sun climbed higher, casting a warm, golden light over their valley, Ada turned to him, a soft, confident smile on her face. "We should start with the garden," she said. Cole looked down at her, at the woman he loved, and then out at the vast, promising land that stretched before them. "No," he said, a slow smile spreading across his own face. "We start with the house." Thank you so much for listening to our story. Please let us know in the comments where you are listening from so we can all connect. And remember to subscribe to our channel Wild West Night. Like the video. And support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.